New York City, the Roosevelt Club on East 45th Street. Saturday evening, March 8th, 1969. One of the most exclusive private clubs in America, where politicians and business executives and wealthy members paid substantial annual dues for access to elegant dining rooms and world-class service, where the interior gleamed with dark wood paneling and crystal chandeliers, and where the staff were trained to provide treatment that matched members' elevated expectations, where being a member of the Roosevelt Club meant something about your status and your success, where the club itself represented the pinnacle of Manhattan's social elite. At the main entrance, positioned behind a polished brass podium that marked the boundary between the public sidewalk and the exclusive club interior, stood Martin Crawford, 54 years old, chief doorman at the Fontainebleau for the past 12 years, someone who took enormous pride in his position, despite its essential service nature, who viewed himself as a guardian of standards, who believed that maintaining the hotel's exclusive atmosphere required careful judgment about who should be welcomed and who should be politely redirected elsewhere, who had strong opinions about race and class, and who belonged in establishments like the Fontainebleau, and who didn't. Opinions that were common among working-class white Southerners in 1969, but that were usually expressed through subtle mechanisms rather than through overt confrontation. At 7:43 p.m., a young black man approached the hotel entrance, 27 years old, walking with the confident stride of someone who expected to be welcomed, who had every right to be there, who carried himself with natural authority that suggested he was accustomed to being treated with respect. The man was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Crawford made in a month, wearing jewelry that suggested wealth, moving with physical grace that indicated athletic background, approaching the Fontainebleau like he owned it, rather than like he was seeking permission to enter. The man was Muhammad Ali, though Crawford didn't recognize him, didn't know that the person approaching his podium was the most famous athlete in the world, was the heavyweight boxing champion who defeated Sonny Liston and Floyd Patterson, and who was currently in Miami preparing for an upcoming fight, was someone whose face was on magazine covers and whose name was known globally, was someone who absolutely belonged at the Fontainebleau, and who would be welcomed enthusiastically by hotel management if they knew he was checking in. But Crawford, who apparently didn't follow boxing or sports generally, who didn't recognize Ali despite his fame, saw only what his prejudices allowed him to see: a young black man approaching an exclusive white hotel, probably attempting to gain entry where he didn't belong, probably someone who needed to be discouraged or redirected before he could enter the lobby and make white guests uncomfortable with his presence. Crawford stepped forward, positioning himself between Ali and the entrance doors, his body language creating a barrier rather than providing welcome, his expression showing the kind of professional courtesy that was actually thinly disguised hostility. "Can I help you?" Crawford asked, his tone making the question sound like a challenge rather than an offer of assistance, his emphasis on the word help, suggesting that what Ali needed was help finding the appropriate place for someone like him, which definitely wasn't the Fontainebleau. Ali stopped, looked at Crawford with an expression that showed surprise more than anger. Surprise that someone was blocking his path to a hotel where he had a confirmed reservation, where he was expected, where management had specifically arranged for him to stay during his Miami training camp. "I'm checking in," Ali said, his voice carrying the distinctive Louisville accent that millions of people would have recognized instantly, his tone friendly but firm. Assuming this was just a misunderstanding that would be quickly resolved once Crawford understood that Ali was a legitimate guest rather than someone who needed to be filtered out. Crawford's expression didn't change. He looked Ali up and down with obvious skepticism, evaluating his clothes and his jewelry and his presence, making calculations that were based entirely on race rather than on any actual evidence about whether Ali belonged at the hotel. "Checking in," Crawford repeated, making it sound like the most unlikely thing he'd heard all day. "Sir, I think there's been some confusion. The Fontainebleau caters to a very specific clientele. Our rooms start at $150 per night. We require advance reservations. We have policies about who can stay here. I'm certain that whatever you've been told about checking in, there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps you're looking for one of the hotels on the other side of town where people like you would be more comfortable." Ali's expression shifted from surprise to understanding and then to barely controlled anger as he processed what Crawford was actually saying. That Crawford was trying to prevent him from entering the Fontainebleau because he was black. That Crawford had made assumptions about Ali's ability to afford rooms or his right to stay at exclusive hotels based solely on his race. That Crawford was using his position as doorman to enforce racial exclusivity that the Fontainebleau officially didn't practice, but that Crawford apparently believed should be maintained through informal barriers. "People like me," Ali said, his voice still controlled, but now carrying an edge that suggested his patience was running out. "What exactly do you mean by people like me? I've got a confirmed reservation. I've got more than enough money to pay for any suite in this hotel. I'm here for legitimate reasons. So when you say people like me would be more comfortable somewhere else, you need to explain exactly what you mean by that." Crawford's face flushed slightly, understanding that Ali was forcing him to either state his racial prejudice explicitly or back down from the position he'd taken. Any smart doorman would have recognized this as the moment to apologize, to check the reservation list, to welcome Ali and move past the initial misunderstanding. But Crawford, like so many people who'd let prejudice override survival instinct, made the catastrophic decision to double down rather than retreat. "Look," Crawford said, lowering his voice, but making his meaning absolutely clear. "I've been working at the Fontainebleau for 12 years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. And young black men, regardless of how expensive their suits are, or how much jewelry they're wearing, they don't belong at the Fontainebleau. I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. So I'm telling you, politely, to leave before I have security. Escort you off the property. Find a hotel where you belong. Find a place where your kind is welcome. This isn't it." The silence that followed Crawford's statement was broken by a woman's gasp. A hotel guest who'd been approaching the entrance behind Ali and who'd heard every word Crawford had said, who understood immediately that this doorman had just made a terrible mistake, who recognized Muhammad Ali even if Crawford didn't, who was horrified and fascinated in equal measure by this confrontation. Ali stood completely still for approximately 10 seconds, not moving, not speaking, just looking at Crawford with an expression that the doorman should have recognized as dangerous, that should have triggered every survival instinct Crawford possessed, that should have made it clear that the person he'd just insulted and attempted to bar from entering the hotel was not someone who would accept such treatment quietly. "What's your name?" Ali asked finally, his voice quiet but carrying complete authority, the voice of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed, who expected truthful answers to his questions, who wasn't asking out of idle curiosity, but was instead gathering information that would be used for purposes that Crawford couldn't yet imagine. "Martin Crawford," the doorman answered, still not recognizing that he was in danger, still believing that his position as doorman gave him authority over this young black man, regardless of who that man actually was. "And I've told you what you need to do. Leave now, before this becomes a bigger problem than it needs to be." Ali pulled out his wallet, removed his driver's license and a hotel confirmation letter, and held them up for Crawford to see. "My name is Muhammad Ali. I'm the heavyweight boxing champion of the world. I have a confirmed reservation for a suite at this hotel. I've stayed at the Fontainebleau multiple times before when I've trained in Miami. I'm expected. Management knows I'm checking in tonight. And you, Martin Crawford, just told me that my kind doesn't belong here, that I should leave and find a hotel where black people are welcome, that you're going to have security escort me off the property if I don't leave voluntarily." Crawford's face went pale as recognition hit him, as he understood that the young black man he'd been trying to bar from entering the hotel was Muhammad Ali, was someone whose name and face were known globally, was someone who definitely belonged at the Fontainebleau, and who would absolutely be welcomed by hotel management, was someone whose presence would actually be good for the hotel's reputation rather than something that needed to be prevented. "Mr. Ali," Crawford stammered, his voice suddenly uncertain, his confidence evaporating as he realized the magnitude of his error. "I didn't recognize you. I apologize. Of course you're welcome at the Fontainebleau. Let me help you with your luggage. Let me escort you to the front desk. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Please don't—" Ali cut him off, his voice now loud enough that people in the lobby were turning to look, were coming closer to see what was happening at the entrance, were beginning to recognize that Muhammad Ali was involved in some kind of confrontation with the doorman. "You didn't make a mistake, Mr. Crawford. You did exactly what you intended to do. You saw a young black man approaching this hotel, and you decided, based solely on his race, that he didn't belong here, that he should be turned away, that he was probably someone who couldn't afford to stay here, or who would make white guests uncomfortable. You didn't fail to recognize me specifically. You failed to recognize that black people can be successful, can be wealthy, can belong in exclusive spaces, regardless of what your prejudices tell you about where we should and shouldn't be." Ali continued, his voice carrying throughout the lobby now, making sure everyone present heard exactly what had happened and what he was saying in response. "I'm not going to accept your apology, Mr. Crawford. I'm not going to pretend that this was just a misunderstanding that can be resolved with a few sorry words. You use your position as doorman to try to enforce racial exclusion that is illegal and immoral. You told me that my kind doesn't belong at the Fontainebleau. You threatened to have security remove me. You made those choices based entirely on the color of my skin, rather than on any actual evidence about who I am or whether I belong here. Ali looked around at the crowd that had gathered, at hotel guests and staff who were watching this confrontation with expressions ranging from sympathetic to uncomfortable to openly supportive of Ali's position. I want everyone here to witness what just happened. I want everyone to understand that in 1969, in America, black people still face this kind of discrimination at supposedly progressive establishments. I want everyone to know that Martin Crawford, chief doorman at the Fontainebleau Hotel, tried to prevent Muhammad Ali from entering this hotel because he assumed that young black men don't belong at exclusive white establishments. Ali turned back to Crawford, who was now visibly shaking, understanding that his career was probably ending, that this public humiliation was being witnessed by dozens of people who would report it throughout Miami and beyond, that he'd just created a situation that would make national news and that would cost him everything he'd built over 12 years of service at the Fontainebleau. I'm going to check into this hotel, Ali said, his voice now calm again, the public statement completed, the message delivered to everyone present. I'm going to stay here during my training camp. I'm going to use the facilities that I've paid for and that I have every right to use. But I'm also going to make sure that everyone knows what happened here tonight. I'm going to tell every reporter who interviews me about my upcoming fight what occurred at the Fontainebleau entrance. I'm going to ensure that this story is told and retold until it becomes part of the history of this hotel and of this doorman who thought his prejudices were more important than treating people with basic dignity. Ali walked past Crawford into the lobby where the hotel manager was already rushing forward, apologizing profusely, explaining that Crawford's behavior didn't represent the hotel's policies, offering Ali complimentary upgrade to the best suite available, promising that appropriate disciplinary action would be taken, doing everything possible to mitigate the public relations disaster that had just occurred at the hotel's entrance in front of dozens of witnesses. Martin Crawford remained at his podium for approximately 15 more minutes before being summoned to the manager's office, where he was informed that his employment at the Fontainebleau was terminated effective immediately, that his 12 years of service couldn't excuse or compensate for the public racial discrimination he'd just displayed, that the hotel couldn't afford to employ someone who would attempt to bar Muhammad Ali from entering based on racial prejudice, that Crawford should collect his personal belongings and leave the property without delay. The story of what happened at the Fontainebleau spread through Miami and then nationally within days. Sports reporters who were covering Ali's training camp reported the incident. Civil rights activists pointed to it as an example of ongoing discrimination that black Americans faced even when they were wealthy and famous. The hotel issued public statements apologizing for Crawford's behavior and reaffirming their commitment to welcoming all guests regardless of race. For Muhammad Ali, the incident became another example of the racial discrimination he'd experienced throughout his life despite his fame and success. Another story he would tell in interviews and speeches about how being the heavyweight champion didn't protect him from prejudice. About how even in 1969, even after the Civil Rights Act, even in supposedly progressive cities like Miami, black Americans still faced people who believed they could enforce racial exclusion through informal barriers even when explicit segregation was illegal. Ali used the incident effectively in promoting his upcoming fight, told the story repeatedly to reporters, framed it as motivation for his continued activism and his vocal opposition to racial injustice, made Martin Crawford's moment of prejudice into a teaching moment about ongoing discrimination that required continued resistance and advocacy. For Crawford personally, the termination from the Fontainebleau ended his career in high-end hotel service. Word spread throughout Miami's hospitality industry that Crawford had tried to bar Muhammad Ali from entering his hotel, that he'd used language suggesting racial prejudice, that he'd been fired for discriminatory behavior. Crawford found work at less prestigious establishments, but never achieved the status or the salary he'd enjoyed at the Fontainebleau. Spent the rest of his working life understanding that one moment of expressed prejudice, one decision to try to enforce racial exclusion against the wrong person, had cost him everything he'd built over 12 years of professional service. The broader significance of the incident was that it demonstrated the limits of legal progress without cultural change. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had made racial discrimination in public accommodations illegal. Hotels couldn't legally refuse service based on race. But laws didn't change the attitudes of people like Martin Crawford, who believed that even if explicit segregation was illegal, informal mechanisms could still be used to discourage black patronage of exclusive establishments, who thought that their positions as doormen and receptionists and service workers gave them authority to enforce racial boundaries through subtle means that didn't constitute obvious illegal discrimination. Ali's response, making the incident public, ensuring it received media attention, using his platform to highlight ongoing discrimination, demonstrated how famous Black Americans could use their visibility to combat prejudice in ways that ordinary citizens couldn't, how public shaming and economic consequences could change behavior even when law alone was insufficient. Saturday evening, March 8, 1969, at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach. The night Martin Crawford made the worst decision of his professional life by attempting to bar a young black man from entering his hotel without knowing that the man was Muhammad Ali, was someone whose name and face were recognized globally, was someone who absolutely belonged at the Fontainebleau, and who would not quietly accept discrimination without making it public and costly for everyone involved. The doorman who didn't recognize the champion, the assumption based on race rather than on any actual evidence, the attempt to enforce racial exclusion at an exclusive hotel, the moment when Crawford's prejudice collided with Ali's fame and refusal to accept degrading treatment quietly. What happened in those 5 minutes at the Fontainebleau entrance? The attempted exclusion, the explanations that revealed prejudice, Ali's public response that ensured everyone present understood what had occurred. The immediate termination that followed demonstrated that even in 1969, even after legal protections against discrimination, Black Americans still faced informal barriers maintained by people who believed racial exclusion could be enforced through subtle mechanisms as long as it wasn't explicitly stated. The incident that shocked Miami, not because discrimination was unusual, Black Americans experienced it constantly, but because it happened to Muhammad Ali, because the doorman had chosen literally the most famous black person in the world to discriminate against, because Crawford's ignorance of who he was dealing with had led him to make a decision that would be immediately public and immediately costly, in ways that discrimination against ordinary black citizens rarely became. Martin Crawford's moment of prejudice, Muhammad Ali's public response, the termination that ended Crawford's career, the story that became part of Ali's narrative about ongoing discrimination despite fame and success. March 8, 1969, when a doorman's assumption that a young black man didn't belong at an exclusive hotel collided with the reality that the man was Muhammad Ali, and the doorman learned too late that prejudice carried consequences when directed at someone with the fame and the willingness to make discrimination public and costly. The night ignorance met greatness and lost everything in the collision. The doorman, who didn't recognize the champion and paid for that ignorance with his career. The incident that demonstrated that even legal protection against discrimination wasn't sufficient without cultural change and without powerful black Americans willing to use their platforms to make prejudice costly rather than just illegal.